Welcome! Today we're diving into an aggressive and exciting line for white, the Blackmar Diemer Gambit trap. I'll show you how to sacrifice a pawn for rapid development and deadly attacking chances against an unprepared opponent. Let's get started. The game begins with the pawn to d4, and black usually responds with the pawn to d5. You then continue with the pawn to e4, offering a pawn sacrifice to achieve quick development and an immediate attack. If black accepts the sacrifice, you follow up with the knight to c3, putting pressure on the pawn sitting on e4. The most natural way for black to defend this pawn is by developing the knight to f6. At this point, you advance the pawn to f3, once again aiming for rapid development. Since the pawn in the center is under attack, black will likely capture it. Now, instead of simply recapturing with the knight, white has an even more aggressive option, taking back with the queen on f3, thereby offering yet another pawn sacrifice. At this point, white can immediately capture the pawn. Now white develops with the bishop to e3, bringing the bishop into the game while also preparing to place the rook on d1 in the future. This can happen either by moving the rook directly to d1 or by castling on the queen side, which would place the rook there automatically and make it very active along the open file. At this stage, black's queen is under attack and must move. Queen to b4, which looks like a very tempting move for black. From there, the queen not only targets the pawn on b2, but also threatens the rook in the corner. If white castles queenside here, the black player might feel confident, thinking, "I've got this." That's because black can now play the bishop to g4, creating a double attack on both the queen and the rook. At first glance, it seems black is about to gain even more material, and white might appear completely lost. But this is exactly the moment where white has a brilliant move that could easily earn a standing ovation from the crowd. The knight to b5, and even if there's no crowd watching, at the very least, you secure yourself a beautiful win. The key point is that the knight is now attacking the pawn on c7. In the majority of games, black becomes greedy and captures white's queen on f3. But that's a huge mistake because white then plays the knight takes c7, delivering a stunning checkmate. Notice that the rook on d1 controls the entire file, so the black king has nowhere to escape. Let's step back for a moment and ask, can black do anything to defend against this threat of the knight takes c7? Unfortunately, there's not much they can do. For example, if black tries to cover the pawn with the knight to a6, or make some other defensive move, white still has the devastating idea of the queen takes b7. Here, the knight on b5 plays a crucial role. It not only attacks the pawn on c7, but also blocks black's queen from defending the pawn on b7. This makes the capture possible, and after the queen takes b7, white is suddenly threatening multiple ideas, capturing the rook, taking the knight, jumping with the queen to saw6 check, or even returning with the knight to c7. Now, let's imagine that black tries another defensive idea, such as bringing the rook to b8, which is something they often do. In this case, white has yet another spectacular winning shot. The queen takes b8. This queen sacrifice deflects the knight from a6, so that it no longer protects the c7 square. After that, white follows up with the knight takes c7, delivering a very similar checkmate. So by now, it's clear that greedily accepting everything white offers is extremely dangerous for black. But what if black chooses a different approach, trying to decline part of the other gambit? One common alternative is for black to avoid capturing the pawn on f3. Instead, black might try to simply defend it by developing the bishop to f5. At first glance, this looks like a solid option. But what can white do in response? The answer is straightforward. First, white captures the pawn on e4. If black responds with the knight recaptures on e4, then white plays the queen to f3, creating immediate pressure on both of black's minor pieces. Black will likely try to relieve the tension by capturing on c3, but after white recaptures with the pawn, the position changes dramatically. Even though black is still technically a pawn up, white now enjoys a powerful position. The queen's attack creates a double threat against both the bishop and the pawn on b7, while white also benefits from open lines and faster development. This gives white excellent attacking chances despite being down material. The main idea of this gambit is to bring your pieces into the game quickly, and overall white has very good compensation for the sacrificed material. Suppose black retreats with the bishop back to c8. In this case, white should continue development with the knight to h3. Normally, this knight would go to f3, but since that square is already occupied by the queen, the knight can take an alternative path. From h3, it is ready to jump to g5 and target the f7 square, which could become a serious weakness. Black will often respond with the pawn to a6, trying to consolidate. Now white can play the bishop to b5 check, which is very useful because it allows white to castle on the next move with tempo. At the same time, notice that white's queen is also eyeing the pawn on b7. To guard against both threats, black will probably push the pawn to ca6. That gives white the perfect chance to castle queenside, creating an immediate threat of the queen takes f7 checkmate. Black now needs to find a way to defend against white's growing threats. For example, they might try the queen to c7. Since this move attacks your bishop, you can calmly retreat with the bishop back to d3. At this point, take a look at the position. White is fully developed, all the pieces are active, and there are threats all over the board. The bishop can swing into play, the knight can jump into strong squares, and overall black is completely passive. Let's see how this can play out. Suppose black tries the bishop to d6, aiming to counterattack the pawn on h2. White doesn't need to bother defending such a small threat. Instead, you continue with the knight to g5, which puts pressure on two different pawns at once. Already black's position is starting to collapse. In the actual game we're analyzing, black pushed the pawn to f6, hoping to chase away the knight, but this only makes things worse. White immediately replies with the queen to h5 check. Black tries to cover the check, but then comes the bishop takes g6, tearing apart black's defenses. After black recaptures with the pawn, white simply takes the rook in the corner. Now black's king is exposed, their pawns are under fire, and the position falls apart completely. Within just a few moves, white is completely winning. Another way for black to try and play more carefully would be to first capture the pawn on f3. After that, white responds with the queen takes f3, offering a second pawn sacrifice. Instead of accepting, black might try the pawn to e6, aiming to finish development while keeping the extra pawn. In this case, white can continue with the bishop to e3, both defending the pawn on d4 and preparing to castle queenside if needed. According to the database, one of the most common moves here for black is the bishop to b4, pinning the knight. White should calmly reply with the bishop to d3, keeping the position flexible, ready to castle either kingside or queenside depending on how the game develops. At this point, the most frequent move played by black is the bishop takes c3, but this turns out to be a mistake. After white recaptures, it actually strengthens the pawn structure, solidifies control of the center, opens up a semi-open file, and leaves white with the powerful advantage of the bishop pair. Instead of neutralizing white's attack, black has only helped white build an even stronger position. After black castles, the position is very similar to the earlier line. White continues with the knight to h3, keeping all the same advantages: two active bishops aiming at black's king, a knight ready to jump forward, and the option to castle kingside to activate the rook on the f-file. Black may try the tempting knight to d5, attacking both the bishop and the pawn on c3. But this backfires immediately, as white has the stunning sacrifice bishop takes h7, leaving black in serious trouble. At first it looks like white can't sacrifice on h7, but after king takes h7, the idea becomes clear. White plays knight to g5 check, and after king to g8, the key move is queen to h3, not queen to h5. From h3, the queen still threatens checkmate on h7, but now black's knight to f6 no longer attacks her. White can simply castle, planning to double rooks on the f-file and remove the knight, clearing the way for queen to h7 checkmate. If black tries knight to d7, white plays rook to f4, preparing to double rooks, or even swing one across to the h-file for a direct mate. Either way, black is helpless, and white is completely winning. Thanks for watching. See you in the next video.